People think I was afraid to die alone. That wasn't it at all. I was afraid of what they'd do to me while I was still living. There's a difference. And if you're somewhere near my age, or if you're watching this because someone you love is, I want you to understand that difference before we go any further, because everything I'm about to tell you depends on it. My name is Cecily Morrow. I am 91 years old. I have been a daughter, a wife, a mother, a widow, and for the last 6 years, a woman who lives alone in a house that is too big and too quiet and entirely, stubbornly, beautifully mine. I have buried my husband. I've buried 2 of my closest friends. I've watched my children grow into people who worry about me in ways that are loving and suffocating in equal measure, sometimes in the same afternoon. And I have spent more hours than I care to count sitting in that armchair by the window, the green one, the one Gerald always said clashed with everything, thinking about what it actually means to be old in a world that has decided old is a problem to be managed. I want to talk to you about that. I want to talk to you about the year my daughter Margaret decided I needed help, and what happened when we tried to find it, and what we found instead. It is not a tidy story. There is no moment where everyone realizes they were wrong and everything is suddenly fine. But it is a true story, and at 91, true is the only kind I have any interest in telling. Let me start with a Tuesday in November. November because the trees were already bare and the light was that flat gray that makes everything look a little defeated. I had been living alone for 4 years at that point. Gerald had been gone 4 years and 3 months. I was managing. I cooked for myself. I kept the house. I paid my bills, though I'll admit the online banking still makes me feel like I'm performing a magic trick I don't fully understand. I walked to the end of the block and back every morning, slowly, but I walked. I called my grandchildren on Sundays. I read. I watched my programs. I was, by any reasonable measure, a woman who was getting on with things. But Margaret had been watching me the way you watch a thing you expect to break. And that November she called and said, "Mom, I think we need to talk." And I knew, the way you know things when you've been a mother long enough, that the conversation she wanted to have was not one I was going to enjoy. She drove up on a Saturday. She brought my son-in-law, David, which told me this was serious, because David normally treats visiting me the way some people treat going to the dentist. Necessary, not unpleasant exactly, but not something you volunteer for. He's a good man. He just runs out of things to say to a 90-year-old woman after about 40 minutes, and I've always respected him for not pretending otherwise. He sat at my kitchen table and drank his coffee and let Margaret do the talking, which was sensible of both of them. "Mom," she said, "we've been thinking," and the "we" told me everything. This wasn't a thought Margaret had alone. This was a conversation she and David had been having behind my back, in their kitchen, probably after the children were in bed, the way parents talk about things they don't want the children to hear. Except in this case, I was the child. She said, "We've been thinking that maybe it's time to talk about your options." Options. I have always distrusted that word when people use it the way Margaret used it then. Options, in that context, doesn't mean freedom. It means we've already decided something, and we're going to present it to you in a way that makes it seem like you have a choice. I didn't say that. I'm saying it now, 6 years later, because now I can. Then I sat across from my daughter, and I looked at her face. She has Gerald's forehead, always did, wide and honest. And I saw that she was frightened, not of me, for me. And that changed things. You can be annoyed at someone for being wrong, but it's much harder to be annoyed at someone for being afraid on your behalf. So I said, "All right, Margaret, tell me what you're thinking." And I listened. She had 3 ideas. She'd been thorough, my Margaret. She gets that from me. She'd written things down. She had a notebook. I noticed she kept it slightly out of my sight line, which I thought was considerate, and also a little bit funny because I taught her to be organized, and then she was trying to hide her organizational skills from me. She laid it all out. Option 1, I could come and live with her and David. Option 2, they could find me a caregiver, someone to come in during the week, help with the house and the shopping, and what she called the day-to-day. Option 3, and she said this one quietly, gently, the way you say something you know might hurt. Option 3 was that we could look at some communities, some places where there were staff, where there were other people my age, where I'd be safe. I told her I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. And then, because I had raised my children to be honest, and I owed them the same honesty in return, I called Margaret back and said, "Let's try your first idea. I'll come and stay with you for a while. Let's see how it goes. I want to tell you about those 8 weeks because I think they matter, not because they were terrible. They weren't, not exactly. Margaret's house is warm and well kept, and her grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, are loud and joyful in the way that only very small people can be. Little Oscar, who was 4 then, used to climb into my lap without asking, like it was his right, which I found unexpectedly wonderful. I hadn't had a small person in my lap in years. I'd forgotten the weight of it, the specific, alive weight of a child who trusts you entirely with their body. But the thing about living in your daughter's house when you are 90 years old is that you become, very quickly, a guest. Not because anyone means it. Not because Margaret and David weren't kind. They were unfailingly kind. And sometimes that kindness felt like a door, closing very softly in my face. They had a routine, a beautiful, busy, tightly scheduled routine that had been built around their lives, their children's school days and football practices, David's work hours, Margaret's. She does something with computers, consulting. I've never entirely understood it, but it pays well. And into this routine, I was inserted, like a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit, but everyone agreed to work around. Dinner was at 6, not because I wanted dinner at 6. I've never been a 6 o'clock dinner person. Gerald and I always ate late, 7:30, sometimes 8, with the news on low in the background. But 6 was when the children ate, and it was easier if we all ate together, and so I ate at 6 and smiled and was grateful. I woke at 5 in the morning, the way I always have, and lay still in the dark of the guest room so I wouldn't disturb anyone. The guest room had a good mattress. It smelled of the lavender Margaret puts in the linens, which is lovely, objectively lovely, and not the smell of my house, not Gerald's smell, which was, well, that's gone from everywhere now except sometimes. Sometimes, in the back of the wardrobe, I think I catch something. Maybe that's just longing making things up. At my age, longing is very creative, and I was helpful where I could be. I read to the grandchildren. I folded laundry. I still fold laundry faster and cleaner than anyone I've ever met. 60 years of practice will do that. I made my potato soup one Sunday, and everyone ate 2 bowls, which pleased me more than it probably should have. But I was also in the way. I heard it once, not clearly, not a full sentence, just a fragment. David's voice through the wall of the kitchen when he didn't know I was in the hallway. Something about the bathroom in the morning and the schedule, and then Margaret's voice, lower, and then silence. I stood in that hallway for a moment, and I thought, I am the thing they are managing around. I have become a schedule problem. I didn't cry about it then. I cried about it later, in the lavender-smelling guest room, quietly, with my face turned toward the window so the sound wouldn't carry. I wasn't crying from sadness exactly. It was more like, do you know the feeling when you've been holding something heavy for a very long time, and you set it down for a moment, and your arms start to shake from the relief of it? It was like that, the shaking kind of crying, the kind that comes from finally admitting something to yourself. I called Margaret the next morning and told her I wanted to try the second option. She sounded relieved, and I loved her too much to be hurt by that. The caregiver arrived on a Monday morning in January. Her name was Brenda, and she was a brisk, efficient woman of about 55 who had clearly cared for many elderly people and had her methods firmly in place. She was not unkind. She was professional. She arrived at 8 and left at 4. And in between, she cleaned my kitchen in a way that meant I couldn't find anything for 3 days afterward. And she made me lunch that was nutritionally appropriate and completely without salt. And she sat with me in the afternoons watching programs she chose because the remote was somehow always nearer to her. She called me Mrs. Marrow. After 40 years of being Cecily, of being Mom, of being Grandma Cece, I was Mrs. Marrow, which was my mother-in-law's name, God rest her difficult soul. I know you're expecting me to say I was ungrateful. Maybe I was, a little. But I want to explain something about what it means to have a stranger in your kitchen when you are old and alone. Your kitchen is not just a room. It is the room where everything important in your life has happened. I made my children's lunches at that counter for 22 years. I cried into that sink after my mother died. I danced badly, slowly, with Gerald in that kitchen the night we got the news that Margaret had passed her medical exams, because he'd had a glass of wine and I'd had 2, and we were so happy we didn't know what to do with it. That kitchen is 40 years of my life pressed into the walls, and Brenda's presence in it, however well-meaning, felt like someone walking through a church while the service is still going on. Polite, but wrong. And the money. I haven't talked about the money yet, but I should, because that was real, and it mattered. Gerald left me comfortable, but not wealthy. My pension is modest. Brenda's agency cost more per month than I was prepared for, and Margaret offered to help, and I let her for 3 months. And then I sat down one evening, and I looked at the numbers, really looked at them, the way I used to look at the household accounts in the lean years. Gerald was a teacher. We had 4 children. Lean years were most years. And I thought, this is not sustainable, not without becoming a financial burden on my daughter. And I have never, not once in 91 years, wanted to be a burden on anyone. I may have many flaws, stubbornness chief among them, according to everyone who has ever loved me. But I have always carried my own weight. So I told Margaret to cancel the agency, and she cried. And I said, Margaret, please don't cry. This isn't a tragedy. This is just thinking. And she said, Mom, then what? What do you want to do? And I said, let me think. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mom, I need you to also think about the other option, the communities. Just look, just go and look. I want to be fair. I promised myself I'd be fair about this part, because my experience is not everyone's experience, and I know there are places that are good and kind and dignified. I'm not going to tell you that every such place is a warehouse for the nearly dead, because that would be dishonest and it would be unkind to the people who work in them, many of whom are doing something genuinely difficult with genuine care. But I will tell you what I felt when we visited the one Margaret had found. A bright place, cheerful colors, a common room with a piano that no one was playing, a garden that was nicely tended, staff who called me sweetheart within 5 minutes of meeting me, which I found notable. They showed me a room, a single room with a window that looked over a courtyard, and a bathroom with handrails, and a board on the wall where they wrote the day's date and the day's activities. And the activities for that day were 9 o'clock, morning stretches, 10 o'clock, crafts, 12, lunch, 2 o'clock, a film, 4, social hour. I stood in that room and I thought, I have been making my own decisions since 1935. I have outlived a depression, a war, 4 presidents I liked and 6 I didn't. And I have been making my own decisions every day of my life for 9 decades. And now a cheerful young woman with a clipboard is going to tell me that at 2 o'clock I will watch a film, and at 4 I will socialize. I have never, not once in my entire life, socialized on a schedule. I smiled. I said, how lovely. I asked very polite questions. And on the drive home, I looked out the window of Margaret's car and I thought, not yet. I am not ready to give up the thing that makes me me, because the thing that makes me me is the right to decide what I do at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That right is not a luxury. At 91, after everything life takes from you, the husband, the strength, the steadiness of your hands, the friends who leave one by one until you have to count them on one hand and still have fingers left. That right is the last essential thing. And I wasn't ready to hand it over to a clipboard. I told Margaret, not yet. Maybe someday, but not yet. And she was quiet in the way that meant she was worried. But she was also, somewhere underneath the worry, relieved to hear the fight still in me. Because Margaret has been listening to the fight in me her whole life, even when it exhausted her, even when we argued about it. And we have argued, believe me. We are 2 stubborn women who love each other enormously and occasionally cannot be in the same room. And I think some part of her would have been more frightened if the fight had gone. So there we were, no daughter's house, no agency, no community with a 2 o'clock film, just me and my 2 big house, and the green armchair and the problem that had not, despite everyone's efforts, been solved. What happened next was not planned. I want to be very clear about that. I did not have an idea. I did not devise a strategy. I was not clever. What happened was that I was tired and lonely, and I went outside to get the mail, which I know sounds small. But some days at 91, going outside to get the mail is an event. And on standing at the mailbox next to mine, the house next door, which had been empty for 2 years, and then, in October, had suddenly acquired new tenants, was a young woman I had not properly met yet, wrestling with a stroller and a paper bag of groceries and a toddler who had decided that this moment was the precise moment to sit down on the pavement and refuse to move. She looked the way people look when they have been holding things together all day and have one hand left, and they need one more hand. I know that look. I wore it for 15 years of raising children and working and keeping everything moving. I know it in the bones. I said, "Can I hold something?" She looked at me the way you look at someone when you've been running so hard, you've forgotten that other people exist. And then she said, "Yes, please." I held the paper bag. She picked up the toddler. His name was Marcus. I would learn this later. He was 18 months old and already had opinions about pavement. And she got the stroller open, and the groceries inside, and the baby settled. And then she stood up and looked at me and said, "I'm so sorry. I'm such a mess. I'm Layla." I said, "I'm Cecily. And I'm the opposite of a mess, which isn't always as good as it sounds." She laughed. She had a surprised laugh, the kind that escapes before you can stop it. That was how it started. Not with a plan, not with a program, with a paper bag and a toddler who didn't want to walk. Layla was 29 years old. She had moved in next door from the other side of the city, following a job that had then been eliminated 4 months after she arrived, which is the kind of thing that happens to young people now in a way that would have been unthinkable in my day. But then, my day had its own cruelties. I won't pretend otherwise. She was a single mother. The toddler, Marcus, was hers. And there was also a daughter, Priya, who was 7, and had her mother's eyes and her own very definite thoughts about most things. There was no husband currently in the picture, and she didn't offer details, and I didn't ask. When you're 91, you understand that not every story needs its full context to be understood. The important thing was, she was alone in a new place with 2 small children and a job search that wasn't going well, and no one to call at 7 in the morning when Marcus had a fever, and she needed to get Priya to school. She had no one to call. That was the thing that got me. Oh, I've had that. I've been that. Not at 29. Gerald and I were together by 29, for better or worse, and some days both. But after Gerald died, when the children lived their own lives an hour away, and the phone felt like a prop in a play, and the mornings were so quiet it made your teeth ache, I knew the shape of that particular loneliness. I recognized it in her, the way you recognize a language you once spoke. We started small. She would knock on my door in the morning sometimes. Priya needed to be at school by 8:15. Marcus was feverish. Could he just stay with me for an hour while she did the drop-off? Of course he could. Of course. Marcus was not a placid child. He had, as I mentioned, opinions. He had opinions about what to eat and what to touch and what belonged where. Some of those opinions were physically dangerous, but he was also warm and curious, and he used to press his whole face against the glass of my cabinet where I keep the blue dishes, Gerald's mother's dishes, the ones I never use, and breathe on it and look at his own foggy reflection like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. I found that unbearably lovable, still do, and Priya. Priya was 7, which is an age I have always found underrated. 7-year-olds are old enough to have real conversations and young enough to still find old women interesting rather than embarrassing. She sat at my kitchen table doing her homework while I made dinner, my dinner, the late dinner I'd gone back to eating now that no one else's schedule applied. and she asked me questions the way 7-year-olds do, without filtering for what's appropriate. She asked me why my hand shook. She asked me if I'd been alive during the war. She asked me if it was true that people used to have black and white vision, which told me she'd been looking at old photographs and drawn a logical but incorrect conclusion. She asked me once very seriously whether I was afraid of dying, and I said, "A little, but mostly I'm just very tired by 9 o'clock." And that made her laugh so hard she nearly fell off the chair. I hadn't made a 7-year-old laugh like that in years. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it. Layla, in turn, started coming to check on me. Not in the Margaret way, not with the clipboard and options energy, not with the weight of worry pressing against everything she said. She just knocked. She brought things sometimes, a container of whatever she'd made for dinner, which was often good and occasionally alarming. She went through a phase with something called shakshuka that I have mixed feelings about. She'd sit in the kitchen while I made tea and talk, really talk, the way people used to talk before everyone started looking at their phones in every available silence. She told me about her mother who lived far away and was ailing, about the job she was trying to find, about Marcus's father eventually in pieces, without self-pity, but also without pretending, about her fears, the real ones, not the polished version. She was afraid she wasn't enough for her children. She was afraid the money wouldn't last. She was afraid she'd made a mistake coming here, and there was no way to know yet whether she had. And I recognized all of it. The specifics were different. Her life and mine are separated by 6 decades and more change than either of us could fully account for. But fear arranged itself the same way in a woman's chest in 1967 and in 2018. I know that now. Fear doesn't update its methods. I told her things too, things I hadn't told anyone in a long time, because there was no one to tell them to, or the people I might have told were gone. I told her about Gerald, the real Gerald, not the sanded-down version you present at funerals, but the complicated man who was brilliant and sometimes selfish, and who loved me in ways that were imperfect and real. I told her about the year after he died, when I used to leave his coffee cup on the counter in the morning because I wasn't ready to put it away yet. I told her about my friend Dorothy, who I've never entirely recovered from losing. Dorothy Sable, who was funnier than anyone I've ever met, and who died of a stroke at 78 in the middle of a sentence, which was, her daughter said, exactly how Dorothy would have wanted it. I hadn't talked about Dorothy to anyone in years because the people who remembered her as I did were mostly gone. Layla didn't know Dorothy, but she listened, and that was enough. It might have been more than enough. It might have been exactly what I needed. By spring, things had shifted in ways that were hard to describe, but impossible to miss. I watched Marcus 2 mornings a week so Layla could go to interviews. Layla's daughter Priya had developed the habit of stopping at my door on her way home from school. Just to say hello, she always said, just to see if I needed anything, though she was 7 and then 8 and then 9. And what she actually needed was to sit in a quiet kitchen with someone who wasn't stressed, and I could give her that. Layla helped me with the grocery shopping, which I'll admit had become genuinely difficult. Not the choosing, I can still choose a tomato better than anyone, but the carrying, the lifting, the logistics of a body that doesn't always cooperate. She changed a light bulb I'd been leaving alone for 6 weeks because the step stool and I were no longer on speaking terms. I killed her basil plants 3 consecutive times before I managed to grow her a new one from my own, which I did feel proud of. We were not a family. I want to be precise about that, because the word family can crowd out other words that might be more accurate. We were something older than that, or differently shaped. We were neighbors in the original meaning, people who needed each other and showed up for each other and asked for help and offered it without turning it into a whole production. My mother's generation would have recognized it immediately. Mine recognized it with a kind of grief, because we'd been so busy building lives that insulated us from each other that we'd forgotten this was how people used to live, how people used to survive. Margaret visited in April that year. She stayed for a weekend. On the Saturday afternoon, Layla knocked with Marcus on her hip, and a question about whether I had any time, which I did, and which turned into her and Margaret sitting at the kitchen table for an hour talking about some television program they'd both been watching, while Marcus tried to fit an entire wooden spoon into his mouth, and I made tea and Priya read a book in the corner, with her legs over the arm of the chair the way children do when they're comfortable somewhere. Margaret was quiet on Sunday morning, and before she left she said, "Mom, you seem..." and she stopped. I waited. She said, "You seem like yourself." I didn't know what to say to that. I hadn't known I'd stopped seeming like myself. But I think she was right. I think somewhere in those months, in the business of being useful and being needed and being honest with someone and being listened to in return, I had come back to something I'd been drifting from. Not a person I'd been when I was young. You can't go back, and I've never wanted to. There's too much I know now that I didn't then. But the person I'd always been when I was at my most myself. Stubborn, interested, particular about tomatoes, willing to kill the basil 3 times before I got it right. I am 91 years old. I live alone. I am still most days afraid. But I have found that fear is not the thing that determines whether you live well. What determines whether you live well is whether you decide every day to keep reaching across the space between yourself and another person and offering whatever you still have to give. I couldn't give my daughter a mother who didn't need anything. I couldn't give Brenda the agency, a woman who wanted to be managed. I couldn't give that cheerful community with its 2:00 film schedule a resident who didn't mind handing over the last of her own authority. But I could hold a paper bag for a tired young woman at a mailbox. I could watch a toddler for 2 hours and marvel at the way he breathed on cabinet glass. I could sit across a kitchen table and tell the truth, and listen to truth being told in return, and find that the exchange left both of us a little less alone. That's what I found when all the options ran out. Not a solution exactly, more like the thing that was there before we started calling these things solutions. Community, the old kind. The kind that's built out of proximity and need, and the willingness to knock on a door. I still have hard days. I fell last January, in the hallway, not the bathroom, though I appreciate the dignity of the distinction. And I lay there for a moment on the floor, looking up at the ceiling, and I thought very clearly, this is it. This is the moment Margaret warned me about. And then I thought, I'm fine. I'm not hurt. I'm going to get up. And I did. It took a while, but I did. I didn't tell Margaret for 2 weeks. I told Layla that afternoon. I don't know how long this arrangement will last. Bodies have their own schedules and they don't consult you. Some morning I will wake up and the step stool, and I will have a more serious disagreement, or something else will happen that is less recoverable, and then the question of what comes next will have to be answered in earnest. I know that. I've been 91 years on this earth. I'm not going to pretend I don't know how stories end. But here is what I know right now. In this afternoon, in this green armchair that clashes with everything, I am not managed. I am not a schedule problem. I am not Mrs. a marrow to strangers who mean well. I am Cecily, and I made my own lunch today. And this morning, Priya knocked on the door to show me she'd lost another tooth. And Marcus, who is 3 now and opinionated about everything, has apparently decided that I am his best friend, which he announced to Layla last week without any prompting, and which I found so surprisingly moving that I had to pretend I was looking for something in the kitchen so she wouldn't see my face. Don't go somewhere to be taken care of before you've tried something else, before you've knocked on a door, before you've held a paper bag, before you've sat across a kitchen table from someone who is struggling in a different direction than you are and discovered that 2 struggles faced together are sometimes lighter than one. I'm not telling you it's easy. I'm not telling you it solves everything. I'm 91 years old. I'm done pretending that anything solves everything. But I am still here, in my house, in my armchair, with my late dinner and my grandchildren on Sundays and my neighbor's daughter's footsteps on my porch and my blue dishes still behind the glass where they belong. That is enough. That is, I have finally understood, exactly enough.